I wasn't supposed to be home yet. The bachelorette party had been planned down to the last detail, an extravagant, champagne-soaked night at a rooftop bar, the kind of place where the walls pulsed with bass and every drink cost as much as a small utility bill. Riley, my best friend since college, had insisted on the full experience. One last wild night before you say, I do, Ash, she had teased, dragging me onto the dance floor. But my heart wasn't in it. It should have been. I was 24, engaged to a man that everyone, my parents, my friends, society, approved of. Zach Vanderbilt was charming, ambitious, and handsome in a way that made people do double takes. The perfect fiancé. The kind of man who looked good in engagement photos, the kind you imagine standing next to you in holiday cards, the kind of man who knew exactly what to say when your mother interrogated him about his 5-year plan. And yet, I felt hollow. Even as my friends cheered and raised their glasses, I could feel the pressure of the wedding like a weight pressing on my chest. Something about it all, about him, felt off. Maybe it was the way we fought. The way he could turn cold and dismissive, always knowing just how to twist my words back at me. Maybe it was how he had proposed in the most calculated way possible, down to the photographers hiding in the bushes, ready to capture my shock. It had been picture perfect, staged for maximum effect. For the first time in months, I asked myself a question I had been too scared to say aloud. Do I really want to marry him? I needed air. I needed space. I told Riley I had a headache, ignored her protests, and slipped out of the club. I should have stayed. I should have forced myself to smile, to sip another drink, to play the part of the happy bride-to-be. Instead, I drove home. And in doing so, I walked straight into the moment that would change everything. The apartment was dark when I stepped inside, except for the soft glow of the kitchen lights. At first, I thought Zach wasn't home. Then I heard his voice. Bro, it doesn't matter. By tomorrow, her money is my money. I froze. The words felt like a slap, cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city outside. A pause. Then a low, smug chuckle. She's a trust fund baby. This was always the plan. My blood ran cold. He was on the phone. I could hear the muffled voice of whoever was on the other end, but I couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. Because Zach kept talking. Yeah, I'll stick it out for a year. Maybe 2. Long enough to make it look real. After that? Who knows? He let out another laugh, like he was talking about some casual, meaningless bet rather than the woman he was supposed to be marrying. I felt a strange kind of detachment wash over me, like I wasn't standing in my own apartment, like I wasn't the woman being discussed so callously. My engagement ring suddenly felt too tight on my finger, suffocating. Oh, she'll sign the prenup, Zach continued, his voice dripping with confidence. Her dad's already pushed it on her. She doesn't even care. And why would she? She's never had to worry about money in her entire life. There it was. The resentment. The barely concealed contempt. I had always known Zach was competitive, that he liked control. But I had never imagined he saw me as something to be won. Yeah, man, I know. It's a guaranteed payday. She's just like every other spoiled rich girl. She wants the wedding, the dress, the big ring, the stupid fairy tale. She doesn't actually think about what comes after. A lump formed in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had thought about what came after. I had imagined our life together, a house, maybe kids one day. I had pictured holidays and quiet Sundays and everything that came with forever. But to Zach, I wasn't a partner. I was an investment. Something to be profited from, milked for every advantage until he was done with me. I clenched my fists, forcing my breathing to stay steady. I had 2 choices. I could storm into that kitchen, scream, demand answers. I could throw the ring in his face, demand to know if any of it had ever been real. But what would that accomplish? Men like Zach never admitted the truth, not when they could lie their way out of it. He would say I misunderstood, that I was overreacting. He'd twist my emotions back at me, make me question my own ears. No. If Zach had spent our relationship treating me like a chess piece, then it was time for me to play the game better. I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. I turned on my heel and walked out as quietly as I had come in. Not to cry, not to mourn, but to plan. By this time tomorrow, Zach Vanderbilt wouldn't just lose me. He'd lose everything. The morning of my wedding, I woke up calm. Not the kind of calm that came from peace or excitement, but the kind that settled over a person before a storm, quiet, controlled, dangerous. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from bridesmaids, vendors, family members. My mother had already texted me 3 times reminding me to breathe and take it all in. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the folder on my nightstand. The one I had spent the last 12 hours filling with evidence. Zach thought I was stupid. Zach thought I was a naive little rich girl who had never faced a real problem in her life. Zach had no idea who he had been engaged to. Because while he had slept soundly in his bachelor suite, dreaming of my family's money, I had been very busy. By the time the sun rose, I had in my possession a recording of his little phone call captured on the security app that linked to my apartment's Wi-Fi. He never was good with technology. Financial statements that showed just how deep in debt he was, gambling, bad investments, loans I was sure he had planned to pay off with my money. Emails between him and a woman named Rachel, whom he had taken on a luxury vacation to Aspen just 3 months ago, while telling me he was on a work retreat. And, for the grand finale, proof that he had been embezzling from his father's company for over a year. Zach had been planning to screw me over. He had no idea that I had just set him up for the downfall of a lifetime. The church was packed with nearly 300 guests. My father, ever the traditionalist, had spared no expense, flower arrangements, string quartets, crystal chandeliers that had been rented just for this occasion. Zach was already at the altar, standing smug in his designer tux, oblivious to the fact that his life was about to implode. I didn't wear my wedding dress. Instead, I arrived in a tailored black suit. A statement. When I walked into the church, the murmur of voices stilled. People turned. My mother gasped audibly. Zach's smile faltered for the first time. Riley, standing in the front row, simply grinned. She knew. Zach took a step forward. Ashley, what the hell are you? I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Then, I pulled out the microphone I had hidden in my pocket and turned it on. Static crackled through the speakers. Every single guest in that church fell silent. Before we begin, I said, my voice carrying through the grand cathedral, I think it's only fair that everyone hears the groom's vows. The ones he made last night. And with that, I pressed play. Zach's own voice filled the room. Bro, it doesn't matter. By tomorrow, her money is my money. She's a trust fund baby. This was always the plan. A stunned silence followed. I watched as the blood drained from Zach's face. His eyes darted to the crowd, where his parents sat frozen in horror. Yeah, I'll stick it out for a year. Maybe 2. Long enough to make it look real. A murmur started to spread through the pews. Gasps. Whispers. Zach lunged for me, reaching to grab the microphone, but I stepped back. I shook my head. We're just getting started. From my bag, I pulled out a folder and held it up for everyone to see. Ladies and gentlemen, in case you were wondering, this man wasn't just planning to scam me. He's been stealing from his own father's company for over a year. A collective gasp rippled through the church. Zach's father, Richard Vanderbilt, stood up so fast his chair toppled over. What? He barked. I opened the folder, holding up the copies of the financial transfers Zach had made to offshore accounts. You might want to check these numbers, Mr. Vanderbilt, I said sweetly. Turns out your son has been using company money for things like, I don't know, luxury ski trips with his secret mistress Rachel. Zach went pale. His mother covered her mouth, shaking her head in disbelief. I let the moment sink in before delivering the final blow. Oh, and one last thing, I added, pulling one more document from my bag. Since I'm in such a generous mood today, I thought I'd save the FBI some time and file a formal report for corporate fraud and tax evasion. And right on cue, 2 men in suits appeared at the back of the church. Mr. Vanderbilt, one of them called, holding up a badge. We need you to come with us. Zach spun toward his father, panic in his eyes. Dad, you can fix this, right? Richard Vanderbilt looked at his son like he was seeing him for the first time. No, he said coldly. I really can't. Zach turned back to me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I tilted my head, watching as the realization hit him. He thought he had me cornered. Thought he was going to play me for a fool, take what he wanted, and walk away untouched. But instead, I had burned his entire world to the ground. I smiled. Well, Zach, I said as the agents grabbed his arms and began leading him toward the exit. Happy wedding day. The church erupted into whispers as Zach was dragged outside in handcuffs. I turned to the guests, flashing a polite smile. Reception's canceled, I announced. But don't worry, the bar's already paid for. Drinks are on me. And with that, I walked out of the church without looking back. Zach Vanderbilt's world crumbled within 24 hours. By the next morning, his name was splashed across news sites and financial forums. Heir to Vanderbilt Investments arrested for corporate fraud on his wedding day. The story spread like wildfire, complete with the audio recording of his betrayal, courtesy of an anonymous email I may or may not have sent to a few choice journalists. The footage of him being dragged out of the church in handcuffs? That went viral before I even finished my celebratory mimosa. Zach's father, Richard Vanderbilt, wasted no time distancing himself from his son. The man had built his company from the ground up and wasn't about to let his idiot offspring drag it through the mud. Within 3 days, Richard released a statement condemning Zach's actions and stripping him of his trust fund. And just like that, Zach went from wealthy corporate heir to unemployable, broke, and awaiting trial. I should have been satisfied. But I wasn't done yet. I didn't run, I built. After blowing up my own wedding, I had 2 options. Hide away, lick my wounds, and let people whisper about poor Ashley. Turn my public humiliation into a launch pad. I chose option 2. In the weeks following the scandal, I took control of my own narrative. Zach had called me a trust fund baby, acting like I was some clueless girl who had never worked for anything in her life. He was wrong. I had 2 degrees in corporate law and a sharp mind, one I had spent far too long dimming for the sake of a relationship. I wasn't just going to move on. I was going to thrive. The making of a powerhouse. I used my newfound media attention to my advantage. I started a blog breaking down financial fraud and corporate corruption in terms the public could understand. I gave interviews, framing my story as a lesson in spotting manipulation and financial deceit. I leveraged my knowledge and opened my own firm, specializing in corporate fraud cases. At first, people thought I was just another jilted ex making noise. Then I won my first case, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against a hedge fund executive who had been embezzling money the same way Zach had. Then I won another. And another. By the end of the year, my name wasn't just associated with Zach's downfall anymore. It was associated with power. Meanwhile, Zach was falling apart. While I was rising, Zach was rotting. His trial lasted 6 months. The evidence was airtight: bank statements, emails, recorded conversations. He had no way out. In the end, he struck a plea deal and avoided major prison time, but he lost everything. His job? Gone. No investment firm would touch him. His trust fund? Gone. His father cut him off permanently. His social circle? Gone. Nobody wanted to associate with a fraudulent, disgraced ex-heir. By the time he was released, he was living in a studio apartment, working odd jobs just to afford rent. The man who once laughed about making me his investment was now the one struggling to pay his bills. The irony? Delicious. One last encounter. 2 years after the wedding disaster, I ran into Zach. I was speaking at a corporate ethics seminar, one of those high-profile, exclusive events filled with CEOs, lawyers, and financial analysts. I had just finished my presentation when a familiar voice said, "Ashley." I turned. Zach. Except he didn't look like Zach Vanderbilt, the arrogant golden boy anymore. He looked tired. His once perfect suit was cheap and slightly wrinkled. His confidence? Gone. I tilted my head, studying him. "You're working security now?" His jaw clenched. "The economy's tough." I almost laughed. This was the man who once mocked me. The man who thought he was untouchable. Now? He was standing in a rented blazer, forced to listen as I was introduced as one of the top fraud attorneys in the country. "Did you come over to apologize?" I asked, crossing my arms. Zach let out a breath. "No." I raised an eyebrow. He hesitated. "You were right." That surprised me. He wasn't asking for anything. Not forgiveness. Not sympathy. Just acknowledging the truth. For a second, I saw something real in his eyes. Not arrogance. Not manipulation. Just regret. It didn't change anything. But it made me realize something. I wasn't angry anymore. Because I won. Not just against Zach. Against the entire narrative he had created about me. I wasn't a spoiled rich girl. I wasn't a clueless investment. I was a self-made powerhouse. And Zach? He was just a footnote in my story. Success came faster than I expected. Within 2 years, my firm had built a reputation for exposing corrupt executives, unraveling financial crimes, and ensuring men like Zach never got away with their schemes. I had started small, handling cases no one else wanted, digging through financial statements and corporate records until I found cracks. Once I did, I widened them until entire companies fell apart. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. I had spent years being played, manipulated, underestimated. Never again. Now, I was the one making the rules. People in the industry whispered about me like I was a cautionary tale. You don't want to end up in Ashley Harrison's crosshairs. I let them whisper. I let them fear me. And I never let anyone get too close. Then I met Owen. Dr. Owen Harris was an ethics professor at Columbia, well-respected in legal and business circles. He had spent his career studying corporate corruption, writing about it, lecturing on it. He understood people like Zach. But more than that, he understood people like me, the ones who had been burned and refused to let it happen again. We met at a business ethics conference in New York, the kind of event I usually avoided unless I was being paid to speak. I had finished my panel on financial fraud when he approached me, holding a glass of whiskey that matched mine. "I enjoyed your speech," he said. "You don't sugarcoat things." "Because the truth doesn't need sugarcoating," I replied. Owen smirked. "Exactly. I was used to men trying to impress me, trying to charm me." Owen didn't do either. He didn't try to act smarter than me, didn't offer unsolicited advice or thinly veiled challenges disguised as compliments. He just talked. And more than that, he listened. At first, I thought he was just another academic who had never been in the trenches. Too theoretical. Too idealistic. But the more we talked, the more I realized something. He saw the world the same way I did. Not in black and white, but in the gray areas where corruption hides. Unlike most people in my orbit, Owen wasn't impressed by my reputation. He didn't treat me like a scandal, a headline, or a woman to be admired from a distance. He challenged me. Pushed back when I got too cynical. Called me out when I was letting my anger dictate my decisions. And somehow, that intrigued me more than any compliment ever could. We started working together. At first, it was strictly professional. He consulted on cases where corporate fraud overlapped with ethical violations. I used his research in lawsuits against corrupt executives. But over time, the late-night meetings turned into late-night conversations. Conversations turned into dinners. Dinners turned into moments where the air between us felt charged with something we were both too stubborn to acknowledge. Then, one night, he kissed me. And I let him. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about Zach. I wasn't thinking about proving myself. I was just there. With a man who didn't want me for my name, my money, or my downfall. A man who saw me, sharp edges, scars, and all. I had been bracing for the moment he would pull away. When he would realize that I wasn't soft, that I wasn't built for the kind of love that made people sacrifice. But Owen never flinched. When I got lost in my work, drowning in cases, barely looking up from my desk, he would sit on the couch in my office, reading quietly, waiting for me to come up for air. When I was at my worst, when my anger got the better of me, when I spiraled into the depths of cynicism, he was still there. Not trying to fix me. Not trying to change me. Just choosing me. And I chose him back. 2 years later, we got married. No extravagant wedding. Number 300-person guest list filled with people I didn't actually like. No staged moments for social media. Just us. A quiet ceremony at City Hall, followed by a dinner with a few close friends. No illusions. No performances. Just two people who had seen the worst in others and still chose to build something real together. And this time, I didn't walk into marriage blind. This time, I walked in with my eyes wide open. Owen never tried to be my hero. He never tried to be my savior. He simply stood next to me. Equal. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. 3 years after my wedding turned into a public spectacle, I barely thought about Zach anymore. My firm was thriving. My marriage was solid. My life was mine in a way it had never been before. But the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. Zach was being released from prison. I found out through an email, one of the automated legal notifications I had set up to track his case. It wasn't a big headline this time. No news coverage, no scandal. Just a quiet footnote in the system. He had taken a plea deal, served 3 years instead of 10. Good behavior, early release. It should have meant nothing to me. And yet, I found myself staring at the screen, feeling something. Not anger. Not fear. Just curiosity. Would he try to contact me? Would he reach out, thinking I still cared? Or would he disappear, licking his wounds in some forgotten corner of the world? I didn't have to wonder for long. Because 3 days later, Zach Vanderbilt asked to meet. The message came through a mutual connection, one of my firm's junior associates who had apparently crossed paths with him at a networking event. Zach didn't have many industry contacts left, but he had found someone willing to deliver a request on his behalf. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe because I wanted to see him one last time. To confirm that he was, in fact, nothing to me now. We met in a coffee shop on the quieter side of the city, far from the financial district where he once thrived. I arrived first. I always did. When Zach walked in, I barely recognized him. Gone was the polished arrogance of the man I almost married. The designer suits. The air of entitlement. He looked worn. His suit was off the rack, slightly ill-fitted. His hair, once perfectly styled, had lost its sharpness. He looked like a man who had learned just how quickly the world could forget him. He sat down across from me, silent for a long moment. Then, "You look good." I sipped my coffee, unmoved. "I know." Zach let out a breath, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you do." I didn't ask how he was. I didn't care. Instead, I cut straight to the point. "Why did you want to meet?" He hesitated. "I just wanted to see you." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I spent 3 years thinking about how everything fell apart. About how you destroyed me." I tilted my head. "I didn't destroy you, Zach. You did that all on your own." He swallowed, looking down at his hands. For the first time in his life, he didn't argue. He didn't try to shift the blame. He just nodded. "I deserved prison," he said after a moment. "I know that now. At the time, I told myself I was just playing the system. That it wasn't really hurting anyone. But it did." I studied him, searching for a flicker of the man he used to be. The one who lied so easily. Manipulated so naturally. But he wasn't the same. And neither was I. He looked up at me then, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't been caught?" "No," I said without hesitation. "Not even for a second?" I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Zach, if I had married you, it would have been the worst mistake of my life. I don't waste time thinking about alternate realities where I ruin myself." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the city moved on without us. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said finally. "I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. The damage I caused. What I took for granted." I didn't respond. Because I didn't owe him anything. Not forgiveness. Not closure. Not kindness. Finally, he pushed back his chair and stood. "Take care of yourself, Ashley." I didn't say it back. I just watched as he walked out of the coffee shop and out of my life for good. And when the door swung shut behind him, I felt nothing at all. The past had finally closed itself behind me, and I had no desire to reopen it. Zach was gone. Not in the dramatic way I once imagined, ruined beyond repair, begging for my mercy. No, the truth was far simpler, almost anticlimactic. He was just another person I used to know. Another cautionary tale. Another man who thought he could manipulate his way to the top, only to find out that the world didn't bend for him the way he thought it would. And I had built something real. Something unshakable. My firm had become one of the most powerful names in corporate fraud investigations, handling multi-million-dollar cases that once would have been buried under red tape. I was no longer just the woman who exposed Zach Vanderbilt. That scandal was now a footnote in a much larger story, my success. I had found a true partner in Owen, a man who matched me in both ambition and integrity. Someone who didn't try to tame my fire, but knew how to stand beside it without getting burned. And for the first time in my life, I felt untouchable. But life has a way of circling back. And one evening, as I sat on stage at a legal conference, preparing for a panel on financial ethics, I saw her. A young woman, standing near the back of the auditorium, twisting a ring on her finger. She was nervous, hesitant. Like she wanted to ask something but wasn't sure if she could. I knew that look. Because once upon a time, I had been her. After the panel ended, I made my way through the small crowd of attendees, shaking hands and answering questions. But I kept an eye on her. She lingered, waiting until the last of the crowd had trickled out before approaching. "Ms. Harrison," she said, her voice quieter than I expected. "Can I ask you something?" I set my glass of wine down on the table beside me. "Of course." She hesitated, glancing at the door like she might change her mind. But then she took a breath and met my gaze. "I'm engaged to a CFO," she said carefully. "A rising star in his company. On paper, he's perfect. But..." She trailed off, unsure of how much to say. I already knew. I had heard this story before. I had lived the story before. "You found something," I said, watching her carefully. "Something that doesn't add up." She nodded. "Suspicious financial transfers. Business trips that don't make sense. Conversations that stop the second I walk into the room." She swallowed hard. "I don't have proof. Not yet. But my gut tells me something is wrong." I studied her for a long moment. She didn't need my advice. She already knew the answer. She was just hoping I'd give her a reason to ignore it. I wouldn't. "People like that," I said slowly, "don't change. And they don't stop. Not unless they're forced to." Her eyes flickered with understanding. She already knew what she had to do. She just had to decide if she was strong enough to do it. I didn't press her. Didn't tell her what steps to take. She had already taken the first one, choosing truth over comfortable deception. And as she walked away, shoulders squared, steps more confident than when she arrived, I knew she would be fine. Zach had once planned to use me for my money. He had laughed behind my back, assuming I would never be anything more than a stepping stone in his climb to wealth. Yet in the end, I was the one controlling millions. But my greatest victory wasn't in ruining his life.